Welcome, friends, to the APUSH Dig, where we will build together a critical understanding of U.S. history through analyzing the processes of change. Now that we have explored all the essential big topics of AP U.S. history, it's time for us to do some big picture review. Today we turn our attention to the theme of national identity throughout U.S. history. We will examine how the very idea and existence of an American identity developed and has changed over time, and why. In order to achieve this, we will be traveling through time, exploring the concept of an American identity throughout the 9 APUS time periods. So, we shall begin with time period 1, the years of 1492 to 1607, the epoch of first contact and first collision between the indigenous peoples of the Americas and the Europeans. Very clearly, I must state this. There is no such thing as a natural American identity. It did not exist in this period because there was no nation. No nation, no national identity. The nation is created later, and therefore, identity is created later. Historians, philosophers, and kids on YouTube who make slime videos have all wondered what comes first, the nation or the national identity. To me, it's the nation that comes first, or rather the desire for the nation. More on that later. It would also be wrong to describe an American identity as having something to do with Native American cultures in this time period. But we have to remember, Native Americans are not a monolith. There is no one indigenous culture. Diversity is the key to understanding the identity in the Americas before the Europeans invaded. Remember, even the term Native American is a European creation. There were no permanent British settlements in North America before 1607, the year of the founding of Jamestown, so identity was not needed. That comes in the next time period. Time period 2 begins with 1607, again the year of the founding of Jamestown, the first permanent British colony in North America, and continues through to 1754, or when the expansionist hostilities we refer to as the French and Indian War begin. English settlers did not consider themselves American. They were British subjects who were settling in the colonies. Again, no nation, no national identity. Instead, local concepts and concepts of race, class, and religion were paramount in examining the identity of the colonists of this era. Settlers felt a loyalty to their specific colony, but also to their religious denomination. Think about the importance of Calvinism to the Puritans in New England, or Catholicism to settlers in Maryland, Quakerism to Pennsylvania's early settlers, and different types of Protestantism throughout the colonies. Finally, we have to understand that the identity that was being conceived of among the colonists was not a national American identity. It was a settler colonial identity. In settler colonialism, land is the most important resource. Colonists across the 13 colonies all believed in their justifications for the massacres and removals of the indigenous peoples from the land. Also, the settlers all believed in the right to extract labor from the enslaved peoples. Therefore, settler colonial identity was based upon race and thus exclusionary. It could not include Native Americans, because that would get in the way of displacement. It could not include black people, because that would get in the way of the immense profits chattel slavery brought to the settlers. Time period 3 spans from the French Indian War in 1754 through to 1800, the election of our third president, Thomas Jefferson. This era contains the Revolutionary decades, the formation of the new nation, and the new constitutional period. Here's where we can finally talk about a national American identity for the first time. A national identity is not natural, therefore it must be created. The American national identity was created in order to build a wide coalition among the British colonists across the 13 colonies to wage a war of resistance against Britain, in order to free themselves from the economic and geographic restrictions set by the mother country. The American national identity was thus formed in order to break imperial obstacles to capital development in the colonies. But rather than clearly declare the bourgeois intentions of this colonial resistance, the elites of Virginia and Massachusetts used the Enlightenment language of liberty and natural rights as a tool to build that wide coalition that would be needed. Clearly, this national identity would be exclusionary. As stated in the 1790 naturalization law, citizenship was only for white people. And though the language of the Revolution preached equality, class hierarchy was forming in the new nation. Not the extent as in old Europe, but it would be erroneous to act like it did not exist at all in the new United States. Time period 4 begins with the emergence of the Jeffersonian era, enters into the Jacksonian period, and ends with oncoming sectional crises that lead to a civil war. In this era, we see the ideological conflict between a Hamiltonian vision for America and a Jeffersonian vision. It's the Jeffersonian vision that seems to capture the American identity of this time period, that Americans stood opposed to the old notions of aristocracy, while ignoring the contradiction of the landed elites who controlled US politics. To Jefferson, land made people free, and with the purchase of Louisiana in 1803, the US was about to have a whole lot more freedom. Freedom to force indigenous peoples to move west of the Mississippi River, freedom to expand slavery through a second Middle Passage into the Deep South, and the planting of the Cotton Kingdom. Another aspect of the exclusionary American identity can be seen in the nativist reaction to new groups of immigrants in this era, chiefly the Catholic Irish and the Germans. That this anti-immigrant group of know-nothings, who we call, excuse me, the political movement, the American Party, the nativist know-nothings, since they called their party the American Party, it's very telling what they considered to be the ingredients of their national identity. We explore three big U.S. history topics when we explore period 5: renewed westward expansion, the Civil War, and Reconstruction. Americans believed wholly in their own bloated exceptionalism, which they dubbed manifest destiny. War is waged upon Mexicans, and land is taken. Westward, the coarse settler colonial empire makes its way. But as America grew, like every empire before it, it also fractured. Sectional loyalty resounded more loudly than national loyalty in many ways. Northern Yankees felt more connected to their region of the nation, as did Southerners throughout Dixie, a fracture that exploded into a 4-year civil war. Reconstruction, the great period of change following the Civil War. Here we see for the first time the greatest expansion under the umbrella of an American identity. With the Reconstruction amendments to the Constitution, the legal view of American identity of being based in whiteness is struck down. All born in the US are citizens, but still not Native Americans, though. They were not considered to be born in the US, but to their own sovereign nations. We refer to time period 6 as the Gilded Age in US history. This is the era of massive national project of industrialization and urbanization. To me, this is when the Jeffersonian dream of an American identity, virtuous yeoman farmers cultivating freedom from their soil, ends. People flocked to the cities for opportunity. Settlers were squeezed out of the cities into a new westward movement project spurred by federal efforts such as the Homestead Act and the creation and the subsequent shrinking of Indian reservations. But it wasn't the small family farms that succeeded. It were the factory corporate farms that sucked up all of the Western capital. This was a time period of open immigration from Europe, but also of the first immigration restrictions in the form of the Chinese Exclusion Act of 1882. Time period 7 sees us knocking down the door and entering the 20th century. In the 1920s, we see the passage of the strictest immigration laws in our history. Laws so strict, they won the admiration of Adolf Hitler. Racist pseudo-scientific thinking called eugenics was popular throughout American political, business, and educational circles, again winning the admiration of Adolf Hitler. It would seem that after an expansion of the American identity in the last half of the 19th century, the exclusionary character of our national identity roars back. In this era, the Jim Crow society was complete. Segregation was protected by the Supreme Court, cementing in law the tiering of American society. Further, as the U.S. planted its flag on distant shores in this era, like the Philippines, again the Supreme Court upheld the exclusionary notions of American identity in things called the insular cases. The New Deal and World War II era challenged this. It challenged the exclusionary characterization. FDR spoke of inclusion, not of exclusion, and in the waging of war against the fascist regimes, FDR recognized that the U.S. could not still be limiting when speaking of what an American was. Thus, this time period ends with an ideological expansion of the plurality of America. We have two lenses with which to look at the changing American identity in time period 8. First, the restrictive lens, the Cold War. In this sense, we see a rigidity in the imagining of what an American is. An American must be looking backwards towards traditional Christian values, towards the glorification of the free market and capitalism. An American has to be everything that Soviet citizens were not. This was the Cold War, an anti-intellectual period for the American identity. But secondly, what about the enlarging lens, the civil rights movements, the nonviolent civil disobedience of Martin Luther King and the thousands who marched with him, the militance of Malcolm X and exclamations of Black Power, the revolutionary organization of the Black Panther Party? Movements such as these expanded the circle of what an American identity was about. Equal in importance, these movements inspired other struggles for inclusion, such as second wave feminism, the Asian American movement, the Chicano movement, the American Indian movement, and the fight for gay liberation. Finally, time period 9, a most conservative period. The New Deal liberalism of the last 5 decades were slaughtered by the wrath of Ronald Reagan. The conservative reaction against New Deal liberalism, against active and expansive federal government, against civil rights reached power. We've all been wading through this vile swamp ever since. Though it's called the Reagan Revolution, the ideology he espoused was nothing new. Not revolutionary, it was reaction. It was a return to the greatest hits of U.S. restrictionist history. I find it very fascinating to wrestle with and reflect upon the notion of an American national identity. What is it? Why was it created? Who gets to be its judge? Who gets left out? What I find myself ending this self-journey into the past with today is the notion that the American national identity was created first for a very specific purpose, in order to build a coalition of colonists in favor of independence from Britain. Continuing, the American identity has always been exclusionary. By very definition, being American meant you were not British, not indigenous, not enslaved. However, our identity has expanded greatly since the White Declaration of 1790. And never forget that the expansion of who gets to be called an American today is most definitively thanks to the struggles of the very people who were left out of the original definition of American. Thanks, friends. See you next time.